Hello, and welcome to the Religion and Popular Culture podcast, where we talk about religion, popular culture, and everything in between. I am Vivian and as always, I am joined by the lovely Aled Thomas. Hello, Aled.
Greetings, Vivian.
How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. It is currently a little bit rainy outside after we've had some heat of late, so it's nice to bring the temperature down a bit. Yes. I am having a lovely morning.
That is nice. It has been a nice, rainy, cooled last couple of days, which has been very lovely and makes my my escape from Florida feel more worthwhile.
I mean, I'm sure there's other aspects as well that makes it feel worthwhile.
Well, and you are also looking very fashionable today, might I say.
Are you referring to my Kermit the Frog t-shirt?
Yes.
Yes, well, I thought I'd inject some popular culture into the proceedings.
Well, because you definitely knew what we were talking about. Oh, before we get into today's topic, which, as I'm assuming everyone will know, it's fashion, I also wanted to give just a really quick kind of house cleaning. What is that?
Housekeeping.
You know, just kind of housekeeping. I know words. I have a PhD. But we're going to do a bit of housekeeping. So the next episode that we put out, which is going to be in 2 weeks' time, is going to be on a very specific episode of Star Trek Next Generation. So if you are interested in that, if watching the episode beforehand, then consider this a little bit of homework. But it's Star Trek Next Generation Season 3, Episode 4, I believe. It's called Who Watches the Watchers? So we're going to do a deep dive into that episode and everything that is very interesting about that episode, what it reveals about religion, people's conceptions of religion, people's conception of studying religion,
yes.
All of that kind of stuff in that episode. If you're interested in watching it beforehand, then that's just what we're going to be talking about.
Yes, make it so.
Yes. But today, we're not talking about Star Trek, although it might pop up every so often. We're talking about fashion, and in particular, we're going to be talking about how people fashion their identity in a wide variety of ways. And when we're talking about fashion, obviously the first thing you think of are clothes, but fashion is a lot more than just clothes. It's also other versions of adornment like jewelry, but it's also different aspects of body management like tattoos, like the way you wear your hair, like what type of glasses you're wearing. All of those things are also going into this conversation of fashion as well. So the act of dressing is a very individual act, obviously. When I get dressed in the morning, I'm not consulting my family and friends every single time. But it's also a very social act because when I'm getting dressed in the morning, I'm getting dressed for a particular purpose and communicating a certain thing with my attire. And part of this feeds into religion stuff, obviously. So there are certain aspects of dress that are considered religious and that tie you to your social community of religion. Probably the most obvious one that comes to mind to a lot of our listeners would be the hijab, for instance, that many Muslim women wear. But there are subtle identity markers. There are more obvious identity markers. So, for example, just wearing a cross around your neck can be just as much of religious adornment as the hijab is, despite it not being maybe as obvious to some people that that's what you're wearing. And like a lot of these early episodes that we're doing, there's going to be a lot of things that pop up that we're probably going to stop and go, this could be a whole episode, and then we're going to try to move on. But I think that this episode, we're going to be kind of just introducing the idea of the way that fashion relates to religion and relates to identity and the sociology and anthropology of all of these conversations. And then, you know, we may have later episodes where we talk about really specific things within it. I find fashion really interesting as far as markers of identity. Aled, have you ever thought very much about fashion?
Well, in terms of my personal use of fashion, no. I'm not what you could describe as a fashionable person. But I think this conversation today kind of flows nicely from the topic we were discussing a few weeks ago on invented religions, when we discussed the case of Daniel the Jedi being asked to leave a Tesco store because he wouldn't remove his hoodie, which he claimed to be
Yes.
a piece of religious attire. And I posed that hypothetical question of when is it acceptable to ask someone to leave because of religious attire, and which religions are acceptable for Tesco, and and because Tesco's the biggest social marker that we have, of course. But yeah, so fashion is really interesting in that I find, particularly when I was growing up, if we're going to take this to a personal level, when I was a teenager, there was a very prominent emo scene, and I think that the emo movement, if we should call it, had two prominent strands. And the first hand was music, and the second hand is the fashion.
Yeah.
And that fashion cultivated a sense of belonging, particularly with how emo positioned itself as being a community of outcasts and weirdos, for want of a better term. And I say that was as someone who was emo adjacent, shall we say.
Adjacent.
I didn't. I dipped my toe into the waters of emo, but I didn't go full emo, so to speak. So as a teen, I was always aware of how fashion would be a social marker, in that would give it would give other people a quick snapshot of who you are, because you were expressing something about yourself. Now,
Mm.
for obviously, if we are going to take that template and apply it to this socio-anthropological conversation today, is that um, how does fashion allow people not only to cultivate an identity and a sense of belonging, but also how it allows them to communicate with outsiders in a non-verbal sense, which I find to say,
Yes.
because fashion is immediate. When you meet someone, you get to see their fashion before you get to speak to them, before you get to know about them, who they are, where they're from, what they believe. You immediately make a snapshot judgment based on that. And I guess this is where problems of stereotyping come in.
Yes.
But at the same time, and we all instinctively do it, for better or worse, that instant snapshot of someone based on fashion. So fashion is a very powerful thing, and it's also a very important issue to discuss for contemporary religion, because it's part of, as you were quite rightly saying earlier, Vivian, it's something we do every day,
Yeah.
even if it is just a Kermit the Frog t-shirt to do a podcast. But maybe I want to communicate that it's time to play the music and time to light the lights. Oh, I'm so funny. Sorry, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but
No, but it was a very good tangent, because I think that's really setting the stage for what we're going to be talking about today. Because I think, at least today, I want to focus on three primary ways that fashion intersects with religion as well as communication of identity. And this by no means is a limited list of how this happens, but I think it's just the three that I find most interesting at the moment. I've been personally getting a lot more into studies of fashion and identity and religion and myth and how all of these things intersect because of my research project into cosplay. And so I'm trying to not limit it to conversations about cosplay, but talking about, well, what does it mean to put on clothes that look different than your own? One of the most interesting conversations that I've had with myself lately was, what's the difference between clothes and a costume? And there was one definition of costume that I saw that said that it has to hide aspects of your identity, which I thought was really fascinating, because I go, well, if I'm going to a job interview and I hide my tattoo, is that a costume then? Because I'm actively choosing to hide a part of who I am from the people who are interviewing me. So there's a lot of, I think, very interesting conversations that can be had, which might be saved for maybe a different day as well. But there's a lot going on in the conversation of fashion.
It's a very interesting point what you were saying about job interviews, because a job interview costume is a uniform in a way. So, I think about the last job interview I did, I wore a suit. And,
I can't imagine you in a suit.
yeah, I am not a suit guy, and suits have no place in academia. Um, but I still wore a suit to an academic job interview. And that is hiding an element of myself. Now, I'm not saying that I would go in a Kermit the Frog t-shirt, but at the same time, there is an expectation from fashion as well. So if you are taking part in a professional activity, particularly one as important as a job interview, you have to adhere to certain criteria. And the
Yeah.
criteria here is very formal. Um, well, formal dress sounds a little bit too fancy, but there is that formal element, isn't there? And I think that it's more than hiding elements of yourself, but it's fitting in.
Yeah.
It's
There's a
showing,
huge element of fitting in that
yeah.
is related to fashion. And I think that's part of that, markers of subculture that you were talking about. I remember, did you guys have those? I think the company was called Trip with two P's, but those were those really big baggy pants that had or trousers, sorry, in the UK, that had like lots of chains and stuff all over them.
Oh
But they were
my
like, a lot of
goodness.
goth kids would wear them.
Yes, I mean, I don't know the brand names, but I saw these things all the time.
So I had a pair of those.
Of course, because you were so rock and roll.
And I think I wore it like 2 days ever at school, and I wore that with a Metallica t-shirt, and I thought that I was trying to be super goth, and it was just this weird moment of like trying too hard.
Ah, so I mean, I guess this goes without. I think this is the first time I've thought about this. Um, so you went to a school that didn't have uniforms.
No, I did not go to a school that had
So
uniforms.
you got to wear your rock trousers and your Metallica t-shirt.
I did.
Now, see, and that's interesting in itself, isn't it? Because I went to school with uniform, as most schools in the UK do, and that was fostering a sense of conformity that I really don't like.
But it's so I mean I obviously have not been in a school in the UK I think ever. No, I've been once, but it's because I'm an adult. I'm not going to be like wandering into schools right now. But but I see school kids going to and from school a lot, and what I think is interesting is that they are most of the time in their uniform, but you see kids doing these like small tweaks to try to make it more fashioning of their identity.
Oh yes, yes they
And
do.
that's a really interesting thing to sit and really look at, is when people transform their uniform into something that's no longer a uniform is
Yes,
really fascinating.
yes. It begins with not tucking your shirt in as the initial sign of rebellion, and then there'll be little quirky things like rolling your sleeves up in a particular way. If one cool kid in the class is rolling their sleeves up in a particular way, then others will do it. I'm really enjoying the stories of late of schools that are banning skirts. So some of the school boys have been wearing skirts to school as an act of solidarity.
Rad.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. Um, and and yes, and speaking from my own experience as somebody who was a British school kid wearing a uniform, schools will try to clamp down on expressing individuality through uniforms. I mean, and this we're all very, we're all special and we're all talented, creative individuals, but don't you dare express it. Um, and and things like, yeah, having your shirts not tucked in does look a little bit scruffy, but at the same time, um, it is an interesting conversation because I remember there was a wider conversation as well about whether parents could afford school uniforms,
Yeah.
or if on the flip side, some kids would feel maybe bullied or marginalized because they can't afford the latest hip brand. Because, if, for example, you referred to that particular brand of trousers that you bought.
Yeah.
So if somebody didn't have this particular brand of trainers or these trousers, so there's conversations on both sides about the economics of clothes that people wear as well, and even in schools.
Yeah, and so a lot of what we're talking about in this bit is, I think, best summed up as saying that fashion works as a form of like a symbolic language. It's a way of communicating identity that people can just kind of look at. I've noticed there's a thing that a lot of women do, not all women, but a lot of women do, where when they first meet another woman, they give a big like up-down look when they're greeting them. And it's this whole like sizing up of who you are in this momentary thing of what are you dressed as? How is your makeup done? How is your hair? And what does that say about you and how I can judge you based off of that?
I've got a relative who definitely partakes in that activity.
Yes.
Yes, and it is interesting, isn't it? Because we choose to present ourselves in certain ways with fashion, but at the same time, you cannot control the interpretation of others.
Yeah.
And sometimes people will not be. I don't know how to say it. But sometimes people won't quite appreciate what you're going for, maybe. And we see this with religious fashion in particular, if to remember the R word, in that it can be a very controversial topic and a very and sometimes quite a hostile topic about what people choose to wear. And there's discourse as well about whether people are only wearing certain clothing because they are culturally expected to, or if they are doing it through a expression of religious freedom.
Yeah.
And it's a minefield, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Well, and I think when we talk about fashion in regards to religious identity, it's very related to the symbolic language conversation, but I kind of thought maybe we should talk about that a little bit separately because of us being a religion-based podcast.
Yeah.
But obviously, when we think about clothes and religion, we think of things like crosses, we think of things like burqas, we think of things like hijabs or turbans. And these are very obvious, I say, markers, but they're doing the same thing as my trip pants, which was that they are a communication to everyone as to who you are as a person and what your group identity is. And so it's a really important marker of who's inside the group and who's outside the group. So if I'm wearing a hijab, then I know that someone else wearing a hijab is one of me,
Yes.
for example.
Yes.
Which is why I did visit I visited an Islamic temple at one point. And I did have to wear a hijab, and I felt a little bit strange about it just because there was that moment of not wanting people to think that that meant I was an insider, because I didn't want them to feel a false sense of security in conversating with me.
Yeah.
But it is also a sign of respect that I'm doing
Yes.
that.
Yes.
So it is a very strange
That's a very interesting
intersection.
point, because it's an acknowledgement on part of the community that you were interacting with, that you are an outsider but you are entering their space,
Yeah.
and part of entering that space is that you conform to the fashion, but at the same time the fashion is an indicator of belonging, and yet you don't belong.
Yes.
That's quite an interesting thing.
I felt very awkward that I was like starting every conversation with like, I'm not Muslim, but I'm just here. Sorry.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's what I think there's a really interesting story, I think is the right phrasing to go with it, that Quakers use. So historically, Quakers were a subset of Christianity. Lately, they are kind of their own weird religious group that's very free-flowing and hippie-ish, and they're amazing. But so historically they were a Christian group who tried to demonstrate who they were as opposed to everyone else by wearing very plain clothing, by speaking in very plain language. They were trying to kind of keep it so that way all of the fanciness is for God and for religion, and it's not for you as a human. But they described it as a hedge between Quakers and everyone else. Okay. So my wearing of plain clothing, if I were a Quaker, was a way of marking a hedge between myself and you, where I am a Quaker and you are not. Mm-hmm. And lately there has been a shift where the hedge is an inner hedge, which is a really interesting conversation for a completely different time. And maybe we can get on somebody who specializes in Quakerism to come on to talk about it. But it is this really interesting way of understanding that, because I think that it's not unique to Quakers. It's the way that I think everyone understands this kind of marker of the inside, the outside, where we can talk to one another, but there's a hedge between us because I am of this group and you are of that group. And that is marked on my body.
Yes. And it's intentional too.
Yes, very.
So it's not something that just has happened.
Yeah, a hedge is something you have to maintain.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. Yes, I'm liking this hedge analogy.
It's a good analogy.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. You have to maintain it, and you want your hedge to look a particular way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of this feeds into in anthropology, it's called the cycles of alterity, or the kind of ways that difference is reinstituted. Mm-hmm. So if you come to the UK and you're wearing a hijab, for instance, and you are othered because of the fact that you choose to wear this, then you are going to be more marked as different, which means you are going to be more clinging to the things that define you and your social group, which is going to mark you as more different. And it ends up kind of becoming this cycle of markings of difference that maybe started a lot more implicitly or quietly or not as obvious, that become deeper and deeper and more obvious and more segmented because of how much someone on the other side of the hedge is going, you're not with us. Mm. So then you go, well, I'm with them. And then you cement that more and more over time, which ends up having very difficult conversations about, say, Muslims in the UK. Yes. For example.
Yes, absolutely. So Vivian, tell us about. So we've just discussed some of the religion aspect, but tell us about the second part of this podcast, the popular culture aspect. Where does that come into this conversation?
Well, we've already talked about it a little bit with ideas of subculture, the goth, the emo, and how that works in a similar way. And tattoos, which I think should be a completely separate conversation episode, but that these are also part of it, is that, my tattoo marks me and my identity and communicates that with other people. And if someone sees my tattoo, they know that I'm a fan of Lord of the Rings. And so then they see me as one of them, and it can spark a conversation. So when I first met my husband, I was wearing Zelda earrings that were the little Hylian shields. And he still remembers this because that was the conversation that he was able to use in order to start talking to me.
Oh, the icebreaker.
Yeah, because he knew it's like, oh, we have this thing in common. I can start talking to her because we have this thing in common. Yes. And if I wasn't wearing those earrings, I don't know if he would have talked to me.
Yes. No, that's very interesting because when I met my wife, it wasn't on the day we met, but when we were kind of getting to know each other, one day I was wearing a Green Day American Idiot t-shirt. And for context, both my wife and I love Green Day, but my wife was into Green Day before American Idiot came out and became the phenomenon that it was. So she interpreted me as an American Idiot kid. Her words, not mine. in that I didn't know much about the early stuff, as it were. And then she discovered that I did like the early stuff. She's just come to the door and she's frowning at me, but I remember I remember the conversation well. But it was just an interesting aspect of social markers as well. And that, and we did have this conversation about Green Day, and we bonded over their music and so on. But just the particular type of Green Day t-shirt I was wearing suggested something about me as a fan,
Yes.
which
She
is quite
sized
fun.
you up in that very
Yeah,
womanly way.
yes, sized me up as one of the mainstream new fans,
But yeah, like
which she didn't. But
fandom connects you in that way. I don't know if I've talked about this on a religion popular culture podcast episode or if it was what's interesting about, but I did a little bit of research at a fan convention. And when I was there and I was chatting with people, I kind of had a breakdown and I was admitting to someone that I'm very socially awkward and I'm just being overwhelmed by the vast number of people that are willing to speak to me, which I'm used to going into like a church group and everyone's like, when you walk in. So everyone was very welcoming and it was almost overwhelming. And someone said, oh, well, everyone is socially awkward. That's kind of what makes it nice. And I was like, well, how is that helpful if you're all socially awkward? And she said, well, we're all fans of the same thing, so we have the same values. And so there was this really interesting connection between that it was a fan of Jesse Cox, who's a YouTuber. And so it was this idea that because I'm a fan of Jesse Cox and because you're a fan of Jesse Cox, we have the same values beyond just enjoying the same thing.
yes,
That
yes, yes.
we also must agree on other really important factors of life because we enjoy the same simple entertainment.
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes aspects of popular culture have a sensibility, and the sensibility resonates with the audience. So somebody may find an aspect of popular culture appealing because of the sensibility of the artist, for example,
Yeah.
or the person creating this content. And it means that you have something in common with the pop culture and the creator of the pop culture, and as a result you then have that thing in common with the other fans as well. I think it's part of what's made the controversy around Morrissey from the Smiths so interesting, is that for those who don't know, Morrissey, the singer from the Smiths, has made some um, very far right comments in recent years and has aligned himself to far right politics, which is not only shocking on a political level, but it's shocking because the Smiths in the 1980s presented a type of sensibility. The Smiths usually resonated with introverted fans, and that it his politics has been a shock to people who've enjoyed the Smiths.
Right.
And I'm not a Smiths fan, and now I'm quite glad that I'm not, because I struggle to create the separation between the art and the artist. And it's a shock that somebody who would create the music that the Smiths made, or co-create rather, because they were a band of several musicians, would then come out with this far right dangerous rhetoric in subsequent years. So the fans have something in common with each other that they don't with Morrissey, which I think is quite interesting, because he has generally, I mean, obviously, there are going to be some fans who will support him and so on, but generally the reaction from Smiths fans has been less than positive. So the Smiths fans share a sensibility and a sense of political thought that they don't share with the creator of the art that has bonded them. I think that's
Yeah.
quite interesting.
Yeah.
Because
It kind of, on the other side of that was, I remember when loads of very conservative old people realized that Rage Against the Machines was really Like,
Yeah.
it was really left wing, and it was like, yeah, what machine do you think they're raging
Yeah.
against?
Yeah. It wasn't Florence.
Like, I don't understand. But yeah, it was like, it's always fun to see people kind of discover the political backings of music that maybe they didn't really pay that much attention to before.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I mean, something as explicit as Rage Against the Machine, you do have to think, come on, wake up.
Yeah.
But but
Well,
yeah, absolutely.
there's also obviously other parts of popular culture that I think feed into things. So popular culture isn't just media, which I think kind of tends to be a lot of the assumption for people. And I think we've talked about this before, that it's more than just television and music and movies. It's also just the way of general being. I think fashion itself is part of popular culture, of what is the big thing that you're supposed to be doing. And the fact that like mom jeans are suddenly in is just mind-boggling to me, but that's popular culture right now, is what everyone's wearing, and whether or not it's popular, and whether or not people gravitate towards it, and what's the Yeezys for, you know, sneakers, and that's that big thing now. And all of those elements of it are part of the popular culture that we're talking about. So fashion is this really integral part of everything that we're discussing. And like every other aspect of popular culture, it becomes impacted by some of the systems of oppression that are going on. And so fashion can be homophobic, fashion can be transphobic, fashion can be racist. And these are things that I think are important to keep in mind. There's a lot of conversation, for instance, about Black women's hair and how impacted that is by popular culture, by conversations around popular culture, and the racism that's inherently there. I am probably not the best person to be talking about, because if people do not know me, I am very white. And so a lot of the affecting that has happened on Black women and Black women's hair is because of society wanting them to have hair that look like mine. And so straightening and all of these kinds of chemical things that get impacted on them is to try to make them look more white. And this is all part of it as well. So when you're talking about fashion and identity and popular culture, it's not always fun things.
No, no, not at all. And as you were saying, we all engage with fashion every day when we put clothes on.
Yeah.
And that means that some dangerous groups adopt fashion in a number of ways. I'm particularly thinking of the crowd that stormed the Capitol.
Yes.
Fairly recently, and I think of some of the fashionable aspects that they had in common with one another, whether it was the camouflage clothing, or their use of the swastika, or the Confederate flag. Their fashion was very symbolic, and that they were giving their political ideology, and again, it did foster that sense of belonging, that they were like-minded people, and you know, they can quickly identify each other because of these symbols, these icons that they are wearing. And so it, as you were saying, there's the element of social control against, you know, for example, Black women's hair. But on the flip side as well, you've also got that sense of belonging for far-right groups, and promoting a way of thinking. And symbols are very powerful things, because they can be communicated on that immediate level that we were just referring to with fashion, that a lot can be communicated through a simple icon, that they don't need to have a paragraph written out on their shirt. That simple icon says it all, as it were. So there is also that, you know, as you were saying, the non-fun side of fashion as well. Often when we think of the word fashion, we do just think of some nice clothing that you can buy.
Yeah. We think of silly outfits on Fashion Week, but
Yeah. and the latest pair of trainers that look really nice or something like that. But fashion is a very powerful social marker in religious, political circles and in issues of social change as well.
And yeah, and part of that is obviously parts of cultural appropriation happens with fashion. And this can be the thing that everyone thinks of with cultural appropriation, like wearing a Native American headdress when you are not Native American. But it can also be the way you wear your hair, like if I put my hair in cornrows, for instance. Or if I tried to wear an afro, I don't know how my hair would do that, but I'm sure there might be a way. But if I did those things, that would also be a form of cultural appropriation that I would be using as part of fashion, and that there are a lot of very popular fashion icons that are white that do cultural appropriation all the time and get praised for it. While meanwhile, if a black woman went to work using the same hairstyle, would be condemned for it. And that's what makes it an issue.
Yes, absolutely.
And, I know that we did an episode on Kim Kardashian on our other podcast, What's Interesting About, and we didn't really talk about blackfishing and the cultural appropriation that goes on with her, but it's definitely a thing that happens and is an issue, particularly with Kim Kardashian, but is not limited to her. Sorry, that's...
No. Yeah, no, that I was just taking a moment there to think about what you were saying. And as you were saying, a lot of this means that we are not the best people to be speaking about this. I mean, especially me as a white male, we are not perhaps best placed. But I guess this is. Sorry, I'm just thinking out loud now.
But also at the same time, it shouldn't only be on black people to communicate these issues.
Absolutely not.
Which is why it's a bit of a weird catch-22. But maybe we will, in the future, maybe we should have an episode on it, and we can bring on someone who's at least a bit more scholarly focused on the subject matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because as I said before, I'm very newly branching into the more anthropological study of fashion because of my research has kind of taken me there recently. This is kind of new ground for me. So maybe having somebody who knows a little bit more of what they're talking about.
On a slightly more fun note then, why don't you tell us about what you've recently been doing with fashion? Because I've heard bits and bobs from you and it's been something really interesting.
Yeah, I thought this might be a fun way to kind of talk a little bit about this. It might be a full episode later, it might not. But I have been studying cosplay. I've been getting really into it, as well as studying other forms of dress play a little bit more on the side. I've talked a little bit about drag, and I've talked a bit more to people who practice nerdlesque, which is a really interesting kind of side thing, which is burlesque, but nerdy. And they do essentially cosplay where they dress as characters, but then from popular culture, but then they do like a striptease. And in a burlesque style. And I think one of my favorite videos of all time, I will try to link it in the description of this episode, but it's of a woman in a Wookiee costume who is belly dancing to a Klingon band. So it's, which is just a wonderful mix of all sorts of fun things going on. But there's like this, it's a very sexy dance, but it's in a full Wookiee costume, which is just super fun. But yeah, so cosplay, for people who don't know, is this kind of portmanteau of costume and play. And it's the act of dressing up as a character from popular culture. Most of the time it's from an anime or from a video game. And they take elements of their attire and they wear them, but it's more than just wearing the costume. A lot of the people that I've been talking to always talk a lot about the importance of acting like the character when you are in costume. So there was one person who I was chatting with who was getting very mad at the idea of people who were dressed as a particular character from Naruto, who is supposed to be very moody and quiet and keeps to themselves, and they were jumping around and acting crazy. And she was going, that's not what you do, that's not what he would do. so that's not how you're supposed to be when you're in costume,
that's
which is this
interesting.
whole aspect of what we've been saying where it's more than just clothes.
The conduct in it.
Yeah,
I
you
guess
have to.
it comes back to that job interview aspect we were talking about, in that it's not just that you turn up in a fancy suit, that you also have to behave professionally.
Yeah, you
Or
have to
behave
do a
in a
lot more
particular
than
way.
that.
Yeah.
It's the full representation of the self and the full identity performance that I think we do on all sorts of different levels. I on a side note, kind of more personal note, I thought it was really fascinating that there was a time where my husband made a comment about hearing me when I was either on a podcast or was teaching, and he said that it sounded so strange because I sounded different, which I didn't really think of before, but he was saying that it's because of I'm suddenly not like, I'm acting different because
Yeah.
I'm going to act differently when I'm trying to portray myself as this intellectual, like I know what I'm talking about person, than when I'm just sat on the couch, bull crapping with my husband about the latest Zelda trailer. Like I'm going to act differently. And I don't see it as a full performance. It's just a different side of my identity and a different side of my performance of
Yes.
myself.
Well, I was going to say it is a performance, but not. But that doesn't mean it's not sincere.
Yeah.
We all perform in different ways, purely based on who we're speaking to. So, for example, if I was to speak to my grandmother, I would speak to her in a very different way than I speak to you. But that doesn't mean that I'm insincere when I speak to my grandmother. It's just you do have that performative side to you. And I know when people hear the word perform, they often associate it with playing a character and ergo being inauthentic. But that isn't always the case.
Yeah.
And you do
Performances.
present yourself in that sort of ways. And I do it the same with my students as well.
Yeah.
That
Performances are, can be very sincere and are often very sincere. I think of the fact that I primarily study myth, and myth in a traditional way has always been performed. We think of it now as these stories, and we talked about this a bit in our Zelda and mythology episode, but that myth was performed. It was, and to fashion, they would wear masks and they would dress as the characters and perform the myth. And during that performance, they were these characters and they were living this myth out. And it's not a performance in some kind of fake and authentic, we're just going to kind of do this because that's what we're supposed to do kind of way, but it's because of how important that is and how the embodiment of it is really important and how living it is really important. And that's why, there's this really interesting marker then between whether or not you're wearing a particular symbol in your fashion because you think you should, or whether you're wearing it because you definitely want to. To kind of take this in a slightly different direction again, but I'll get back to cosplay later. It's Pride Month at the time of recording, and there is a lot of conversation about performative, support for the LGBT community and who actually is
Yes.
living it.
So what we're referring to here is or are the corporations who are putting a rainbow filter on their logo for a month.
Yes.
And no, we're not going to name any brands, but they're out there. And
I'm sure people know who we're
yeah, and
at least can put a couple names
yes,
to
and
what
have
we're
a
discussing.
problematic history in terms of their treatment of LGBT employees, for example. But then we'll put a rainbow filter over their profile picture on Twitter for a month and put out the Happy Pride post. Yes, absolutely, and that's another performative side in itself, isn't it? And again, that rainbow comes to this conversation about fashion as well, because it's that immediate symbol. So they've dressed their logo in a particular way to present themselves as being pro LGBTQ. But then,
yeah, I was about to say, like my cosplay informant, for lack of a better word, they get mad when you don't act the part as well.
yes,
If we're gonna dress the part, you gotta act the
you
part.
gotta act the part. So when you've cosplayed in the past, Vivian, have you played the part?
probably not, but I've only cosplayed once or twice, and it was in conjunction with things like Halloween.
Yeah, okay.
So I think it was a little bit of a different scenario.
Mm.
But I am putting together a cosplay now that is supposed to be a bit more serious for it because of participant observation, and this is part of the process. And I had a hard time picking the character because I felt like it was important to pick a character that I felt comfortable portraying.
Yeah.
Which is a very funky question to kind of ask yourself of, like, you start kind of really questioning a lot of the characters that you kind of like, and then going, but are they problematic in a way that I don't feel comfortable portraying? Is it, even if it's just something as simple as, you know, how pansy they always make Zelda, you know, where it's just like, well, I'd rather then cosplay as Sheik if I'm going to cosplay rather than Zelda, because even though it's the same technical person, spoilers for Ocarina of Time, it's still portrayed almost as a different character.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's like these kinds of weird questions. And so I've ended up going with Chisei from The Ancient Magus' Bride, which is an anime which we could probably have an entire episode about because it's an amazing anime. But I still don't know how much I fully agree with her as a character, but I think that there are really interesting dynamics to her that I wouldn't mind kind of exploring, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking about the fact I've never cosplayed, but I think I've mentioned on this show in the past that if I did, I would cosplay as Captain Kirk. So I think I've now got to get working on my William Shatner impression. Otherwise, I'm not playing the part. That's not me devaluing. That's just a little joke, but it is an interesting point, isn't it? That the fashion isn't just about the wearing; it's about the living up to the expectation that the costume sets.
Yeah, and I think that that's a lot of what we've been talking about. That it's not something that is unique to the act of cosplaying. It's something that happens anytime you put on any clothes.
Just to bring it back to that school uniform conversation, this has just occurred to me for some reason. I remember when I was a school kid, someone in my year group had done something after school hours. I don't know, maybe they'd sworn at an old lady or something like that. But anyway, they'd done it wearing the school uniform.
Oh.
And a complaint was made despite the fact this was off school premises and was after school hours, they were clearly on their way home or something. I don't know what they did, I can't remember. But a complaint was made to the school because they were wearing that uniform. And we were told by the senior staff of the school that when you are wearing that uniform, you are representing the school.
Yeah.
And you have to behave a certain way. Doesn't matter that you're not in school and that you're on your way home and school hours are over. You are wearing the uniform, you are representing the school, and you will behave in an appropriate fashion. And I even had one, there was one teacher who said something along the lines of, I don't care what you do when you don't have that uniform on, because that's on you. But when you have the uniform on, you are representing the school.
So I never went to a school with a uniform, but when I was doing my undergrad, I was a member of a fraternity, and we had similar, I know, you don't have to laugh so hard. Thank you very much.
You are a living stereotype.
But so that we had similar rules. So if we were wearing any shirt that was of the fraternity, we weren't allowed to do certain things. And I was part of a dry fraternity, which meant that there was no alcohol allowed in any of our parties, at any of our events. Okay. And we also technically weren't allowed to be drinking alcohol wearing an APO shirt or wearing a shirt of the fraternity, because the fraternities, if you're not wearing it, they don't care if you're drinking. You're just not allowed to drink when you're wearing any shirt that has the fact that you are a member of it.
And you are performing the part.
Yeah, so you have to kind of be in that role essentially anytime that you're which wasn't a problem for me because I don't drink, but
but even if you wanted a drink, it does, because that's it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't want to drink.
Yeah. but you're just not allowed to when you're wearing it. I mean, I don't know how many people kept to that rule, but
Yeah.
you know,
But the rule
but it
was
was
there,
the rule that was
and
set.
the expectation was there. Yeah, that's really interesting.
We also had this other, which is another fascinating rule, but we weren't allowed to have any. So it was just, we would just have T-shirts that would have our letters on it and stuff. But we weren't allowed to have anyone else wear them unless they were a brother, unless they were a member of the fraternity. So my mom was going through my clothes when I was leaving to come here to the UK, and she was like, "Oh, I'll take these shirts," and it was like, "Oh, you're not allowed to wear them because you haven't been sworn into the fraternity."
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm surprised at you binding yourself to all these rules.
Well, okay.
That is a very un-Vivian activity.
To be fair, it was so it was a social service fraternity, so it was all service to the community and community service things, and we would
Okay.
go and feed the homeless on Friday evenings and shit like that. So it was which I think is a bit more like me. And again, it was a dry fraternity. I don't drink.
Yeah, of course. I'm just pulling your leg.
It was a very strange fraternity because it was also co-ed. So, and every time that I was at like in my uni, and I would say that I was a member of a frat, and they would be like, "Oh no, you mean a sorority?" And it's like, "No, I'm a member of a frat. It's just a co-ed one."
Oh wow, the layers of this.
Yeah, it's. I mean, we could probably have a whole episode on fraternities and stuff.
Yeah,
Hell, we could have one on just my fraternity, which was a
just
very interesting kind of separate one.
just the politics that are at play here. Now you see, on the other hand, I've always felt like an outsider in everything. I've always had, friends. There's no need for our listeners to feel sorry for me, but at the same time, I can't really think of a time where I've belonged to something like that.
Even when you go to your gigs.
Depends on the gig. So I go to some gigs where I feel like I don't fit in with the audience much, despite the fact we have a shared appreciation of the artist. I've got other gigs that I go to that I do very much have that sense of belonging because I feel that the fans are very like-minded, and I align myself to, there are certain acts that I listen to that I've made friends through, and that's really nice. So I guess yes, in that sense, but I've never been involved in something that had the shirts and the expectations that you wouldn't do certain things. I don't know. I guess it's quite different, isn't it? Because I guess the way I see the frat that you were in is that there was almost like a hierarchy, or a set of institutional rules, for want of a better phrase. Whereas I don't find that with the gigs that I go to.
I mean, yes and no. Like I said, I think that what rules are in place versus how people actually behave are, I think, two very different things. As we know with many religions.
Yes, absolutely. The lived reality. Absolutely.
The lived reality is always very different. And I always found that there were moments where I felt almost more like an outsider in with the group so one of the reasons why I joined it was because it was a dry fraternity and I don't drink and I didn't want the pressures of it. But when we were all hanging out and they were finally able to drink, the kind of exceedingly expectation that I would join in wasn't as relaxed as it might have been in other circles. So I think, there are times where I think when you're joining something because you like one of the rules and then you're able to go outside of that for a split second, like how weird are the kids who want to wear their uniform?
Yeah.
It's kind of that active, I think, sometimes when you're enjoying one of the reasons why there's a rule in place and everyone else hates it, it can kind of make it feel almost a little bit more weirdly outside while inside.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think something we've really seen in this conversation is the way that fashion can straddle that line of outside and inside. That it's not as clear cut as it may seem on face value, that you can be both. As as you were saying, just with wearing the headdress, where that you referred to earlier in the podcast, and you felt the need to say, "Oh, but I'm not a Muslim," because in that act, you were an outsider, but you were engaging in an insider activity to the
Yeah.
point where you may be confused by someone to be an insider. So there's always, and I guess as I mentioned as well, that in my own fashion, I dipped my toe in emo, and that basically I just had jet black hair that was quite long, but at the same time I never felt in. But I guess other people would look at pictures of me as I was as a teenager and say, "Oh yeah, you were definitely in."
Oh yeah.
But I wasn't. But was I?
Well,
Who
yeah,
knows?
exactly. I think that's kind of what, because we were talking about how it's not just your clothes, it's also the way you wear your hair or your jewelry and stuff. And if basically someone gave you the womanly 1-2 look down and took in your hair and went, "Oh, he's one of those emo kids."
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure many people did.
Yeah. But then I guess it's weirder when you get that from somebody who's not an emo saying, "Oh, he's one of those emo kids," and then an emo kid looks at you and goes, "What a poser."
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I just thought it was quite a cool looking hairstyle, so I tried it out. But I never felt that belonging, so I don't think I performed the part of an emo.
Fair. Well, I think that was a really good intro, I think,
Yeah.
to all sorts of different conversations about fashion. And I think we've also kind of painted a couple of possible episodes for us to be delving into.
Yeah, I think so.
Because we didn't even talk about certain aspects like modest dressing, for example, and how that can kind of portray certain things. But I think modest dress could be a whole nother episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's all sorts of different things that we can talk to. And if someone wants to talk to you about how you were an emo poser somewhere online, where could they go, Aled?
They could go to my Twitter page at AledJLL Thomas. And there we can talk all about my poser status. And how about you, Vivian? Where could they go to speak to you to talk about your frat years?
You can talk to me about my frat years also on Twitter at Vivian Asimos. And you can also go to my website, incidentalmythology.com. Well, thank you for joining me, Aled. It's been a lovely conversation.
As always.
And next time we'll be talking about an episode of Star Trek, so I'm excited about that.
I am very excited about that.
Well, until next time, bye!
Bye, folks.